You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, impacts more than 11 million children and 15 million adults in the US alone, and over half of those adults were not diagnosed until past childhood. The neurological condition comes with some frustrating symptoms around concentration and impulsivity control, and today's guest on the podcast is driven to see if yoga tools and techniques can help. In fact, it was the topic of her Yoga Medicine 1,000-hour thesis. Our guest is Emily Mariola, a longtime yoga student and teacher, also the owner of Flex Yoga and the Flex Wellness Center in Ohio. She and her team have also established the Flex Foundation, a nonprofit providing low-cost or no-cost yoga and wellness services in her community. Let's learn more about Emily's 1,000-hour thesis, an 8-week yoga intervention for college students with ADHD. Hi, Emily. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I really appreciate you making time for us today.
I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about all of this.
Let's talk ADHD. It does seem, at least in my social media feed, to be coming up a lot of people being diagnosed as adults and particularly women. So it feels like a pretty hot topic at the moment.
It is for sure. And I actually noticed last week in the Yoga Alliance newsletter, there was a paper published on yoga and ADHD. So I do think that, it's a kind of a hard starting point to me. Yoga can help almost anything in my mind, right? Mm-hmm. Depression, anxiety, loneliness, fatigue, all of these things. Yoga it's so good at helping in some small way for most ailments of the mind and probably of the body too. So it's not a stretch to say that yoga is great for people with ADHD or anxiety or depression or, any of these things. So I think it's not hard to see why we're here. But to me, I think the question is why? What is it about yoga? And in my case, in particular, in regards to ADHD, what is it about yoga in particular that makes such a significant difference? And, I think in general, we all assume it's the movement piece. If you move your body, you feel better. I think we don't have to prove that again. That's known. But there are all of these other elements that are built into the really traditional yoga practice that are so, so good for people with this brain type. Things like meditation and concentration and breath work. These are all parts of the practice in conjunction with asana that are things that ADHD people should practice. If you can't concentrate, you need to practice concentrating, right? If you can't regulate your nervous system,
which sounds really obvious, but also sounds really difficult, right? It's the thing that you struggle with the most. It must be, well, maybe we start all the way back at the beginning before we really dive into the details. Maybe we start with, for anyone listening who doesn't know, what is ADHD and what symptoms come up for people with ADHD?
So, of course, it can be very, very different from person to person, but in general, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects the brain's self-management system, so executive function. So it's like you don't have the internal coach or conductor or parent like helping you organize the world and choices and energy and attention, right? The other thing that we know now that we can, scan the brain is that there tends to be a lower level of the neurotransmission of the feel-good chemicals in the brain, dopamine and norepinephrine. So things like rewards and consequences can be off. They're not quite working the way that they would in someone that didn't have this brain type. So what does that look like in real life? Oftentimes it looks like serious frustration with executive function. So if I have, a buffet table of all of the things, all of the tasks that I need to do in a day, they're all laid out before me. I cannot choose. I cannot order or organize or arrange. And that can go a couple of different ways. Some people then choose nothing and they just get stuck, right? That's one thing that can happen. The other thing that can happen, and this is probably more common for a 4-year-old, they, instead of putting on their shoes and brushing their teeth, they, pet the dog and sing a song, whatever. They choose something out of order, or, something that's not in line with the expectations that they're supposed to be meeting. So it can look a couple of different ways. Inability to attend. So inability to pay attention to something that you don't choose. So there's kind of this talk about changing the name of it to attention direction disorder, because it's not an inability to attend, but it's an inability to direct the attention and to sustain attention, right? So not only can I focus on what you want me to focus on, but I can do it for a certain amount of time, and I can do it when I don't want to do it. So there's the inability to attend. Also tends to have high risk behavior, low impulse control, struggles with emotional regulation. Any of these tendencies can be, on a gradient scale. So someone may really, struggle with, low impulse control, and someone else may have, high levels of hyperactivity. So it's not, it's not like you have all of these things all of the time, but, there's degrees of all of this. So you can imagine can be really frustrating to live with, or live with someone else who, has a group of these qualities. I will also say,
I think you're describing
somebody
that all of us know. I think everybody is thinking of somebody in their mind when you're describing these symptoms.
And I think most people think, well, I do 2 or 3 of those. I also, which is not uncommon. And I think that's why so many people say it's not real. It's like, well, I do that too. Yeah. But the other thing is there's these really great qualities that go with this brain type, things like creativity and, ability to manage high stress or high, risk situations. What do you call them? Extreme athletes tend to have this kind of brain type. People that think outside of the box, musicians, a lot of really, really great qualities. These people tend to be super intuitive. So it's not just, you don't just throw all the bad stuff out there, but there's some really great qualities that come with it too. And some people just kind of tend to fall into something that, they really get to thrive because, they're in a spot where those good qualities can come into play and they're not so tripped up.
Yeah, I think that was what was coming up in my mind as you were talking, that it's like a lot of neurodiverse conditions where it's not uniformly bad, except that our world is set up. When you think about school and you think about the traditional job, our world is set up for you to pay attention for long, uninterrupted periods of time on whatever you're supposed to be doing, whether that's given by your boss or your teacher. And it's really easy to understand that being a struggle. As you said, all of us have some of those struggles, and yet somehow we're able to organize our executive function so that we get done what we need to get done. We might feel the internal struggle, but we're able to talk ourselves through, look, you can pet the dog later. Right now, you've got a deadline and you've got to get this thing done. So that was what was coming up in my mind, of a whole basket of things going on in a world that is set up for things to be done a particular way, except in outlier jobs where people can really thrive when they're built differently.
And for me, being a yoga teacher is one of those ways. I don't have I have a schedule that I can manage. There's big bursts of work, and then there's also times when I'm not working. So I do think, my husband's in the restaurant business, and he always talks about this way that they used to organize things, which is right person, right seat. And I think, if you can get a kid in the right seat, so is that right teacher? Is that right school? Is that, in a bouncy seat instead of a wooden seat? I don't know. But I think for ADHD people, it's so important to get in the right seat.
Yeah, and I think you've painted a really potent picture of what often comes up, at least in what I've seen of ADHD, is in my head, I was thinking of the kid in class who was, making trouble, the class clown, easily distracted, always moving. And that's one aspect of it, but it can also come along with a whole host of other things driven by that frustration of a world that's built in a way that doesn't fit you, that you always feel
Right.
like you're in the wrong seat. And that's anxiety, depression, all kinds of other conditions can kind of come along with ADHD if you don't find tools to manage it. So I can see
Right.
why you have a really personal passion for finding ways to help people with ADHD. How did your thesis project come about?
So I'm so lucky, I should say this first. I live in a community where we have a really wonderful college. It's called the College of Worcester, where I actually went, and I have a completely worthless anthropology degree, but I loved the college and I loved my time there. And our yoga studio is in this same town. And a couple of professors there come to the studio for one thing or another. I've taught at the college a bit. I was an athlete at the college, so it was kind of in the circle. And she, one of the professors is a neuroscience professor, and she approached us about doing a study about an intensive yoga session. We do an intense, our yoga teacher training is a week intensive and then a bunch of other weekends. And she said, I want to study, a change in students after an intensive, and see what markers we get. She also is interested in ADHD, and she has some students who are doing work with ADHDs. And so I kind of said, well, what if we just do this ADHD test? Because I was in kind of the throes of this thing in my own family. And she said, great. So she and another professor and I just started to create this study, where we got a group of college students, 25 or so, and they came to the studio once a week for a session that I led. They were also asked to do a 5-minute breathwork and fixed gaze practice daily over the semester. And then those two professors were also, they were doing some self-report tests, they were doing saliva, they were doing sleep markers. So they were measuring all of these other things at the college. They did that work, the bulk of that work, and I did the yoga portion. Now, we're talking about ADHD
Which is such a
kids.
smart way of doing it. I mean, I have to say, it's such a smart way of doing it, because it gives your project a real rigor that you're not responsible for, because, you don't necessarily know how to administer all of these cognitive tests. Yeah, exactly. Right. So super smart. Work smarter, not harder.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I think, so we did show it, we also asked some kind of personal questions at the end. How do you feel? How did you feel? Would you do it again? And they all said, yes, I feel much better, and I would do it again. So, which to me, that was all I needed. I think we often kind of gloss over when we look at sort of research projects. We're often really drawn to the more objective results. How many objective measures improved through the course of the research. But at the end of the day, as a yoga teacher, what I care about most is, how did this person feel? This individual in front of me, did they think it helped? And if they did, as a yoga teacher, not a researcher, I get to give that a tick and go, it's worth doing then. If somebody feels better, I almost don't care how much the the objective markers improve or not. If it feels useful, therefore it is useful. Yeah. And, for me, I'm not a researcher, so I don't, that's not the road I'm going down. I want people to come to my studio that are struggling with this, and for me to be able to say, let's try these things and see if it works. And, in my world, that's enough. And will you come back and do it again? Because there has to be some consistency for any kind of marked change. And what I often hear, if someone calls me and says, my kid has ADHD, or I have ADHD and I'm really struggling in this way. And I'll say, okay, what have you done so far? And 99 times out of 100, they say, well, nothing. Or they'll say, I've taken medication. But, they're just, now they know, but they don't know what to do with what they know. And they don't, okay, I have it, so now I have an excuse. But what are you practicing, or what do you want to be different? And that's, I'm also not a therapist, so I can't do that work. But I can say, look, if you have ADHD and you're in a yoga class that teaches these things, if there's a breath work component, there's a mindfulness component, if there's a concentration or a drishti, fixed drishti at some point in the class, and you're doing asana, and you're doing this interoceptive work, it's all there. Like, all the things that you need to practice are right there. And, they'll say, well, running's my meditation. Like, yeah, but it can feel that way, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And if running is your meditation, and I accept that, okay, let's say that's true, and you're physically active, okay, but what about these other pieces? Are you also practicing, patterned behavior, which asana is, right? Can you do a pattern over and over again, whether or not you want to? And can you do it at the beginning of your practice and not skip it or change it? Because learning how to work in a pattern can be really helpful for people who have executive function problems or struggles.
Brilliant.
So,
Well, let's pause there. So, a quick summary for people who are following along so far. It was an 8-week intervention, 45-minute weekly yoga session with you, and we'll dive into those details in a second, plus a daily practice of focused concentration of drishti that they did on their own, and you gave them a video to help guide them through that. And in the end, there were some really positive outcomes, significant differences for 11 out of 18 self-report measures, and 1 out of 3 of those more objective cognitive tests that the researchers gave them. So there were definitely some big improvements, not necessarily across the board, but 11 out of 18 self-reported measures to me is pretty exciting. And you've already started diving into where I wanted to head next, which is what are the most important components of that 45-minute yoga practice that you shared. And you've started talking about that already by talking about having several different components. Movement, I presume, is a sort of outlet for energy, and also that training of moving through a pattern that isn't necessarily one of your choosing, the asana, as well as breath work and meditation. So let's talk about what you put in that 45-minute yoga session, which I'm guessing you drew from what you found most helpful and perhaps what your son finds most helpful.
Yeah. So, it's funny, I've been practicing yoga long enough. In the beginning, I wanted to do pincha and crow like so many of us. And then there was a time I was really doing a lot of yin, and there was, it kind of been all over the place. And after doing this thesis, I've kind of come around to the idea that a pretty traditional 8-limbed path, an 8-limbed practice, I would say, is the best bet.
So Patanjali was right? Wait, what?
Maybe,
you heard it here first, listeners.
or at least the system is right? If I can teach a class that gets people, in their body, that gets them, asking the question, how do I feel? Where do I feel it? If I can get them to be able to understand that they can increase dopamine and decrease dopamine, if they can regulate their nervous system with breath or movement or thought patterns, then all of a sudden you're giving people control. You're giving them control of their physical body, you're giving them control over their emotional state, and you're giving them hopefully some control over the way that their brain works, which is what managing ADHD is. It's how can you train your brain the same way that you can train your body? And in a yoga practice, it's in there. If you do asana and you add the gaze to the cues and you add the breath to the pattern, it's in there. So I started the way that I, originally started, and the first 200-hour training I ever did, which was actually a Baptiste set flow. You start still, you do a little integration, cat-cow, you do sun A's, you do sun B's, you do a power sequence, you do a core sequence, you standing balance, you forward fold, and you finish with shavasana, some version of that. And if you teach it based on the idea that those elements should be in there, yamas and niyamas at some point, if you're giving some mindfulness or whatever, pranayama, asana, dharana, dhyana, like all of those things you don't have to say a whole lot to put them in a 45 or even a 60-minute flow. In some ways, I feel like I did all this work and all I need to do is teach a normal vinyasa class.
We talk about this a lot on this podcast, that intention it's just the most important thing. It's almost irrelevant what you do. depending on the purpose that you bring to it. And when your purpose is, we are moving, we are breathing, we are paying attention to sensations, we are focusing our gaze and the focal points of the mind, it almost doesn't matter what you do, because
it's there. It's
you're
happening.
describing the yoga practice right there. It's happening whether you kind of think about it deliberately or not. So yeah, I think that's come up on here before. Like we almost overthink it. The tools are all there in the practice already, and all we need to do is just point to it.
Right. And I think too, as yoga teachers, you hear things, and social media has kind of kicked everything around, I think, and you can teach vinyasa without ever doing asana, and you can, if you can't sit still in shavasana, then you can't really do yoga. And I think those kinds of conversations, any conversation is, it's good to ask the question, but I almost feel like I've backtracked after all of this time, and I've just gotten back to the really simple part of teaching a yoga class. And I do think asanas need to be there, and I don't think you have to be still in shavasana. And I think still for one person is completely different than what looks still for another person. And it's the same things we ask beginning teachers: be empathetic, pay attention, teach a solid class, and you don't have to perform, you don't have to come up with anything new. It's there.
Well, let's tease those 2 points apart, since that's kind of where you started. I definitely think you can teach a class without a sun A in it, but I'm not teaching with ADHD or for ADHD. You mentioned how important the sun salutation flow is for that sort of imposed discipline. These are the shapes we do. This is the rhythm we do them in. This is the order we do them in. And can you get yourself to do it every class, whether you want to or not, whether you feel ready or not? So talk about that sort of discipline, that tapas aspect of having a prescribed flow.
I should also say I've taught plenty of classes without a sun A or B, so I'm not opposed.
It is possible.
I do think it's there for a reason.
Sure.
Why? Because is the question why? Is that what you're asking me?
Just talk about it more was the question. So take it wherever you want to.
Particularly for people with ADHD, pattern behavior, whether it be get up, brush your teeth, take a shower, put in your contacts, whatever the pattern is, can set you in motion. And if getting going is a struggle, if that doesn't have to be decided, you can use the pattern to create some momentum.
I love that. You're overcoming decision fatigue by taking some of the decisions off the table. These are the things we do.
Right. And ADHD people really tend to struggle if the pattern gets interrupted. So, the big joke on social media is nothing ruins an ADHD person's day like having a 3 p.m. appointment. So, as soon as the pattern's interrupted, it's like you have to start all over again. You can't pick up where you went off. So transitions are really, really hard. They're really hard for kids, especially emotional transitions and time and space transitions. So an A and a B helps you practice a pattern beyond maybe your interest level or even your energy level. And that's just training, right? That's the practice. You do it when you don't want to, and you do it regardless of how you feel, and learning that that's possible. And that sometimes at the end of that, you've gained a little momentum is a good thing to know. Now,
and I'm taking it as a teacher, you don't even necessarily have to say that in a class.
No.
It is its own proof. The student feels that I've done the thing. I didn't have to think about it. It was just the thing that I do here. And now the ball's kind of rolling. I'm already into it. Once you see yourself do that in one context, it becomes possible to do it in others, whether you as the teacher point to it really obviously or not.
Right. And for me, and then, after that portion of class, there's nothing I love more than a, super creative flow. And, people that I know in our studio that have ADHD, because obviously this is something we've talked about here, they really start to thrive. They tend to really like that creative part. They tend to try things that I'm not even saying. They're doing a handstand and I've got everybody else in down dog. And, I don't mind that either. I'm like, let's do the pattern work. And then it's a free for all. You can do whatever you want. I'll support, but let's do this first. Let's brush our teeth first,
Yeah. Yeah, have the veggies first and then dessert.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then the other end that you talked about was being still in Shavasana, which I've definitely come across before with students who are wriggling and shifting in Shavasana. And I'm not sure whether it's physical discomfort or mental agitation. So what are the sort of options that you provide when being outwardly still isn't helpful for somebody in Shavasana?
I love when I see people fidgeting and fussing and, struggling a little bit, because there's so much potential there to
Yeah.
feel different. So some of the things I'll do, I have one student in particular who's, very, very physical, very hyperactive. Um, and so sometimes we'll put blocks in his hands, so there's some pressure. Um, a towel over their eyes, any of the hands on the belly, any kind of um, interoceptive guidance I can start with. Can I talk them into something first? And also sometimes I just let them fidget. Like, okay, it's really hard for you to stay still. What happens if you take three, force yourself 3 breaths and then you do whatever you want? I think it's okay to be that way. It's okay to not be still in Shavasana. And if the goal is to be still, there's some people that are never going to be successful. So I'm just really careful about saying, be as still as you can be. Or, if you want some support in Shavasana, we can do a couple of things to get you a little more grounded. You could do a weighted blanket, you could do a dark room, you could do, there's lots of options, but I think it's more the dialogue. What's the expectation? The expectation is that you ask yourself these questions, how am I doing? Where do I feel something? Am I being still or am I not? A lot of times ADHD people have no idea that they're not still. It's so normal for them to be, restless in some ways that it's, they're unaware.
Yeah.
So I don't want to
So
be
I think there's some really
them.
helpful tips there around giving the body something to do, like something else to feel, the block on the hand or the hand on the belly or covering the eyes or covering the body, but also just softening your own expectations as a teacher of perfect stillness is not necessarily required. And that really makes me think about meditation. You mentioned that being an important part of it. How does somebody sit still for meditation if sitting still and focusing on one thing is the very thing they struggle with the most?
I think again, it's managing expectations. Can I get 10 seconds out of you? Can we do it? Can we, let's say you set up a mantra at the beginning of class. Can we use it again in tree pose where you're having to do this kind of this balance work as well? So we can layer it. I don't think that for people with ADHD saying, you're going to sit cross-legged and easy in Sukhasana and we're going to do 15, 20 minutes is nothing but frustrating. But I can say, well, let's build up to that. Let's start with, tree pose, fixed gaze. You'll have this balance work that you'll get to do, and that will occupy some of the, some of your brain firings. But we'll see how we do there, and then we'll see how we do when we take a break between, Navasana and wheel pose or something. You can cue them into, we're doing this work and it's very brief and the expectations are really low. Let's see how it goes. Doesn't work? Fine. We try it again tomorrow. The same as someone who struggles to do crow pose. You could teach, there's people I've taught crow pose for 2 years and we're getting there slowly. It's no different than teaching an ADHD person meditation, right?
Yeah. I think there are some really powerful things there because you started off earlier in our conversation mentioning the person who says running is my meditation. And I know people like that. And I definitely feel that sometimes myself when I'm hiking. So I get it. But your point for people with ADHD is I also want you to feel that focused and embodied when you're not running, when you're in tree pose or when you're sitting still in between two poses. And the only way that you'll get that feeling is by practicing that. So you're talking about introducing techniques that you then layer into class. Here's a mantra. Now let's use that mantra in tree pose. Now let's use that mantra when you're still in between two poses that require quite a bit of exertion. Now, what if you could sit for 10 seconds with that later in class? See how that feels. Try it out. There's that sort of open-endedness of providing a tool, trying it in different contexts and giving it space to work, not work, work sometimes, not work other times. That all makes sense to me.
I think what you just said is the most important part. It works sometimes. It doesn't work all the time.
Right.
But if this practice is how can I manage ADHD, whether or not I'm using medication to do it, um, it you have to practice. You have to train your brain to work differently than it's naturally inclined to do. The same as if you were trying to teach me math. Like I would have to really, really work.
And so would I.
To understand.
So we would be, I'm guessing,
Right.
probably quite unsuccessful if I were teaching you math. But in any case, carry on.
But I think we can say the same thing, to teachers and with kids in class with ADHD. We just need to work.
Yeah.
They need to do different work with their brain than the kid who maybe doesn't have this, this constant stimulus for searching for input. And fixed gaze is you can see these kids they're looking for something to pay attention to. So fixed gaze is, to me, it's such a great start. And sometimes it's just real them understanding that, oh my gosh, I can't do that. I can't.
So talk to me about that. How are you teaching that in a class? Are you telling people where to put their gaze and then asking them to see if they can keep it still?
Yeah. That simple. And, sometimes it's a point on the floor. Sometimes it's a point on the wall. Sometimes it's, do you need to look at your hands, or do you put a sticker on the floor? I don't care what it is. It's just, you get the urge, and there's some vagus nerve connection that neuroscientists I work with can tell you, you get the stimulus to move or change or look or search. And if the self-management system in your brain isn't working, you just do it. So it's not like you have the person's, you don't have your brain saying, no, we're concentrating now. You have to practice and let the stimulus come and not respond to it. So that's the practice. It's not that the stimulus won't come. It's that it comes, you recognize that it's happened, and you don't. And that's really, really hard.
That the gap between stimulus and response that Viktor Frankl talks about, that I think probably every yoga teacher has themed classes around at some point, but you're asking them to look at this point, the sticker on the floor, keep your eyes there, and see if when the impulse to move your eyes comes, you can not move your eyes. And I'm guessing that, again, the expectations are low. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Yeah. So some really common themes coming up of offering a whole range of tools and then creating space to explore, test that out and see how it feels. See if you can do it for 2 seconds. See if you can do it for 5 seconds. See if you can do it for 10. And just creating that open-ended invitation that if you can do it here in this room, maybe you can do it outside this room as well. Yeah.
One of the other things that I love yoga for is, emotional regulation can be so tough. And, if, let's say I have people in a hot power class and I put them through a really rigorous flow, and then I take them to the top of the mat and you're standing still, and it's like, okay, what's the dialogue in your head? And, a lot of times it's aggressive and frustration and comparison. And, we all do that, right? It's not uncommon to have an emotional response to a big physical ask. So then the question that you can ask in a yoga class is, okay, what are you going to do with or about that? You could exhale, start over. You could continue to be angry for the next segment. You could smile. You could, however many, limitless options. But for ADHD people, I think a lot of times it's that pause you just talked about. Oh my gosh, how do I feel? Am I having an intellectual or an emotional, unregulated response to something? And can I recognize when I'm upregulated, and can I recognize when I'm downregulated? Because I probably don't want to be doing certain things when I feel all of these things: an increased heart rate, rapid breath, frustration, furrowed brow. If at the grocery store I have these same sensations, I probably should, turn my cart around and go home, or, whatever it is. So it's practicing getting yourself upregulated and then just kind of letting it sit there for a minute. So that you can recognize what's happening. A lot of times when with our son, he would go from 0 to erupted in such a short segment of time. And, and I would say later, how did that happen? And he would, I don't know. It just happened to me. And so there was he didn't feel it coming on. It wasn't like he thought, oh no, I'm about to say something or do something stupid that's going to get me a ton of trouble and I'm not going to be able to get out of this. He wasn't getting any of those signals. So he wasn't able to, stop the freight train. Once he started learning what those signals were, increased heart rate, you feel your blood pumping through you. Okay, I'm upregulated. What do I want to do with that? And sometimes, again, there's success, and sometimes no matter what you want, you're just not going to be able to.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of common themes coming out of this. So if we kind of draw them all together for what you were focusing on in that 45-minute class that you did each week for 8 weeks, you had the physical practice, and it sounds like that had a bunch of different roles for you, as it does for all of us when we're teaching or practicing. There was firstly a physical outlet of energy, give the restlessness somewhere to go. There was the prescribed practice, the programmed practice aspect of it. This is the order we do the things in. This is when we do them. This is the breath reference we use while we're doing them. That sort of externally imposed discipline side. And then there was also the vegetables and then the dessert of you do the thing in order. And then we have some fun. We do some play. We have some creativity. There's a bit of a free for all. So all of that from the physical asana side. And it also gave you opportunities to point to introspective and inward focused techniques, like noticing breath rate, noticing heart rate, noticing temperature, noticing internal dialogue. The physical practice was an excuse to pay attention to thought, feeling, sensation, which then becomes useful later on in practice of what do I want to do with that feeling? I can continue with it. That's fine. I can change it, turn it around. I can channel it. That's all fine. So there was that whole physical basket. You talked about fixed gaze, directing the gaze to certain places and inviting people to see if they could hold it there, maybe notice the impulse to look away and see if they could overcome that impulse. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. You talked about sprinkling in meditation, offering a technique that you might use a few times in class in different contexts. And again, give it space to, can you sit with that for 2 seconds, 5, 10? Could you sit with it for a minute? And then we talked about the sort of the shavasana piece of giving physical contact, pressure, or things that help people keep their eyes closed, and also not providing judgment around whether you're able to be still or not. We haven't talked about the breathwork piece yet. So let's talk a little about that.
I love breath work, and I have it, I add it to the beginning of each of my classes. Sometimes it's, 5 minutes, sometimes more or less. But for me, I don't want to exaggerate, but it's immensely helpful. I think that if you can recognize that is it this or is it, where are you?
Mm-hmm.
You have two choices. Is there a quick, rapid inhale, an energetic kind of tightening or shortening or, moving forward, or is there a softening and a releasing and a sinking back? And if you can really know where you are just in regards to inhale and exhale, it's good information.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's varying degrees of all of that. But if I don't practice compromising my inhale and the practice of compromising my exhale, so can I do exhale retention? Can I do, breath of fire? Once I have a handle on where am I in regards to the nervous system and using the breath as my cue, can I then disrupt the breath and keep my mind where I want it to be? So if the first part is the breath is responding to my energetic or emotional place, and I can kind of start to discern that, my breath is my cue. So now I know kind of where I am. The next step to me is now let's disrupt the breath and manage the nervous system. And that's good work. Because then when
and
you
it sounds
get
kind of similar to the approach to asana of, can I do something difficult and agitating and upregulate my nervous system and still be aware of my thoughts and potentially direct my thoughts? So a really similar approach to breath work. And there's that, again, that discipline portion of it of, can I regulate my breathing in this prescribed way and still feel the way inside that I want to feel?
And some of the stats with ADHD people, that I think it's like 33 or something percent of people with ADHD are likely to have addiction issues. The rate of people in car accidents, I mean, the numbers are frightening. So if I can, if let's say I'm prone to high impulse behavior and I love that upregulated feeling, and once I get on that train, I cannot wait for it to just crash. Like that's my dopamine, right? But it takes all of that to kind of get me going. If I can practice doing that, sitting still with breath of fire, and I don't have to do anything about it, I can just get myself there and then I stop. And there's no, you've not gone off the
That's a
rails.
really interesting point, because I think to me that's kind of counterintuitive. Of, I think if I were designing a class for ADHD, which I would never do because I would have no idea what I was doing, I think my impulse would be, I want things that are going to down regulate and things that are going to calm and soothe. And I love the fact that you brought out that if you're somebody who thrives on an upregulated state, isn't it amazing to have tools in your toolkit that are safe, that don't involve you driving a vehicle, for example, that can get you that feeling of upregulation? It's in your control. It's in your back pocket whenever you want it, sitting still, safe in your house. That's a really potent thing.
And I think it's just even recognized. My body can feel this way, but I don't necessarily have to do anything with it.
Yeah.
And I don't have to, all of these things that raise dopamine. I don't have to do drugs. I don't have to, porn, sex, drugs, fast car. All of these things. You can feel the way that you feel when you want that thing, and train yourself to not actually have to do it. Now that's of course very, very hard to do. But if your other choice is, to do these things that have gotten you in trouble 1,000 times before, it's probably worth giving it a try, in my mind. A lot of my ADHD people do not want to go to yin or restorative, or that is terrifying to them. But if I take them through a 60-minute power flow and we do some of this stuff and then they're in Shavasana, then sometimes I can get them to settle and to enjoy the feeling of being settled.
We've all had a microcosm, I think, of that experience of coming into practice with a lot of internal agitation or energy, at the end of a really stressful day, and the feeling at the end of a challenging, fast or sweaty flow of all of that having had an outlet, and now I can be more peaceful. So I think that to me is one of the easiest things to relate to. So we've talked about a whole heap of things: the physical side, the mental side, the breathwork side. And you talked about starting, and I presume you meant within the same session, starting with awareness of what your breath is doing now, and then introducing practices that regulated the breathing and kind of challenged you to disrupt that slightly. Well, we'll go back to the study and talk about the results and implications. But you did hint to something there that I think would be really helpful for people listening who don't have ADHD and don't want to teach classes specifically for people with ADHD, is if you're a teacher or a practitioner in a general group class, some of the behaviors that you see in other people that maybe your instinct is to ascribe to a lack of manners or a lack of care might just be the way that they move through the world. So let's talk about how people could recognize some ADHD behaviors and be a bit more compassionate about them. You mentioned coming late, starting late. You mentioned kind of wiggling or fidgeting in Shavasana. What other behaviors would you like teachers to recognize as being just perhaps neurodevelopmental issues?
It's the same as, I suppose, being a fourth grade teacher. It's like, they talk without being spoken to. They laugh out loud. They talk to their neighbor. They're they're always the one that knocks over their water bottle. They roll their mat out and it slams on the ground. I mean, it's like, it's the same as I can see my 6-year-old Ian in my head. It's like, they're just kind of create a ruckus wherever they go. And that's not always true. I mean, that tends to be the more hyperactive. There are also that people that are not that way. It's way more internal than external. But, we're lucky we have a really huge room for our yoga studio. And, if anyone kind of grumbles, I'm like, move across the room, right? It's just, there's another spot. Give them a little space. But I do think, getting an ADHD person in a yoga class is, they're not in their element often, right? This usually isn't the place, they'd be better at Cirque du Soleil practice in general. So to me, it's like, how much kindness can we extend to let this person, the same as someone who comes in and you see them kind of closed off and unengaged and in the corner and, already lying down in child's pose. To me, it's just, it's the other end of the same spectrum. How can I be just as kind to the person who, doesn't want anyone to even know they're there, as I can to the person who wants everyone to know that they're there? And, the more you teach, the better you get at that. And the better your community gets too. I feel like we've been here long enough now that, I can give another teacher of mine an eye if they're in class and be like, hey, head that way. We've got someone that needs a little barrier, or we've got someone that needs shushed. You do the best you can with all kinds of different people in the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the important thing that I would take away from that is people bring all kinds of things to class, whether they are, neurodivergence or they're just going through something right now today. And resisting the tendency to ascribe that to personal ill intention, I think is really important. It's just people are doing the best they can, making their way through life. Right. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're being disrespectful of the class or the space or the other students. They're just doing the best they can with the lot they've been given today.
And I do think, there are, some of these, like you said in the beginning, some of these social behaviors, we have a world that works really well when people follow the rules, the social rules. And, when you interrupt people a lot, and when you're really loud, or when you're, you don't raise your hand, you don't bring a pencil, all of these things, it's already hard for that person, and they probably already know. So, what happened with our son was, all through 4th grade, he did wonderfully. And then we got to this point where it was like, every 10 minutes I'm getting a text from the teacher, didn't bring a pencil, turned around in his seat, didn't raise his hand. And once you let anyone believe, regardless of the, neurodivergency, let them believe that they have control and they're choosing not to behave well, you kind of get in trouble. I don't know a whole lot of 4th graders who, want to stay in for recess, or if they could raise their hand, usually it's like, oh shit, I forgot. Here I am again. Yeah. Same problem 2 minutes later. So I think, as yoga studio owners and teachers, we have to be super careful to assume just exactly what you said. They're doing the best that they can. And regardless of whether or not it's frustrating for me or the person beside them, I have to assume that this is as good as it gets today. Because if I don't assume that, then what? Right.
Well, kind of what's the point of all of the other stuff we're doing in yoga if we can't assume that people are trying to do the best they can? Right. What's the point of it all if we can't be a little kinder to each other? So I know we're running short of time. Let's talk about the outcomes. We said some of the measures improve, and it was 11 out of 18 of those self-reported measures that I personally, if I were experiencing something, would be the ones I would be most interested in, but also 1 out of the 3 more objective cognitive tests that the researchers applied. So what were the big ticket, high level outcomes of the study that you want to share?
I think it was self-awareness. When they, were asked, did you do better at X? And that could have been a, executive function question. Were you more aware of your, sympathetic state? And if they can say yes, to me, that's a huge step. So
Right.
those markers, right? It's not that you have to be successful in doing anything, but step one is recognizing. So when they were asked questions like that, how do you feel? And they said, well, at least I knew what I felt, regardless of whether or not I was able to tamper or edit or change behavior. To me, that's successful. There were students that said things like, the breathwork was frustrating to me. I can imagine it was. It is to most people, right, when you start. So I think, those kinds of answers, I would again say it's enough. If there is some improvement in executive function, in knowing how I feel, where I feel it, when I feel it, and if there is any sort of inclination to do more of that, because I'm not sure why it felt better, but it felt better. And that was kind of what we got a lot of. I don't know what it was, but yeah, I'd go again. It was great. That's really kind of where we landed. The saliva markers didn't show much. The sleep, I think maybe college students aren't the right people to be testing sleep on. So we didn't get great results with sleep. But really the positivity came from these self-report measures. And, the fact that I think all but maybe one said, yeah, I would do this study again and I would recommend it to others. And many of them said, but I don't know why. And to me, I don't think there has to be it doesn't have to be an answer. I don't know why I do yoga sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just keep doing this thing because for some reason it feels like it's working.
This is actually a really interesting companion conversation to an episode I recorded recently with Valerie Nopick on some research into interoception. And a lot of the themes that you've spoken about today kind of came up in that paper too, of we don't actually need to know why these tools help us or even how these tools help us. They seem to help us anyway. And isn't that just a lovely thing to know as a yoga teacher and a yoga student, that if you keep offering people opportunities to show up and notice how they feel and recognize that they might then have some choices about what they do with those feelings, that stuff can't help but have flow-on effects, right?
Now, I will say, if I were going to do another study, and I won't, it's too hard, but I would love for Tiffany to do it, to see how TCM could help people with ADHD. I love that question that she asks, would I feel better if I put something in or took something out? And I think about that all the time when I'm talking to people with ADHD. And I think, sometimes the answer is, you need to take some of that energy out. You need to use it up in some way so that you can rest, or you need to put in some, some fuel in one way or another. And I just think it would be such a wonderful approach for people that have ADHD, because I really believe that food, sugar, sleep, hot, cold, all of these ways that TCM kind of asks questions could be incredible for people with ADHD, because they don't know. You don't know if you tend towards hot or tend towards cold, or whatever the question's being asked. But that would be a great study too.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a natural flow on from your big premise of how am I feeling? What am I feeling? Where am I feeling it? It's the sort of next question is, big picture, what do I need to do about it? Do I need to put things in, or do I need to take some things out?
Yeah, for sure.
So if we summarize for people in terms of how yoga can help with ADHD, we talked about several baskets of things, and the physical movement piece of being either that outlet for energy or an input of kind of prescribed forms, organized forms, discipline. This is the way we do it.
To increase dopamine.
Yes.
So if you tend to be someone who can't get going, the practice can be really good in that way.
Yes, the kickstart, but also the break for people whose tendency is to want to move in uncontrolled ways. So it could be that adding something in or that taking something out. We talked about the importance of practicing fixed gaze, of noticing that you can place your eyes in different locations and then seeing if you can keep them there. Noticing the impulse to move the eyes, and sometimes they'll move, but sometimes you'll be able to resist that impulse and keep your gaze fixed in one place, and how that becomes a practice. We talked about meditation, maybe less as a really formal, long-lasting thing to start with, and more of a matter of kind of drip feeding a tool or a technique to focus the mind, introducing it in different contexts, and then again, inviting that noticing of, do I feel the impulse to do something else? Can I ignore that impulse and stay focused on the thing? Even if that's just for a minute in between really spicy flows, or even if that's just while I'm holding tree pose. We talked about breath work as being an opportunity both to notice some of those internal signals. Where is my breath at now? And then also that sort of prescribed form discipline side of it. Can I make my breath behave in certain ways and be okay with how I'm feeling on the inside? We also talked about that as an up regulation or down regulation thing. Can I use a breath work that really hypes me up to give me that upward regulated feeling and have that in my toolkit when I need it and not necessarily have to do anything else? And then we talked about a whole heap of invitations to find sensation in the body, to investigate and interrogate how you're feeling, to notice the details of it, and to give some form to that in Shavasana by pressure or tactile contact, to give restless hands or feet or faces or eyes something to do. What am I missing? Anything else you want to leave people with?
No, I mean, ADHD is wonderful and terrible. And I think, everyone has to, it's all a scale. And sometimes I feel like, for myself, there's times when it's been really, really disruptive in my life. And then there's times it's been so immensely helpful. So I think, if what I would say to someone with ADHD is you have to figure out how it's working for you and how it's working against you. And if you're not going to ask those questions, nothing will change. You can take medication and things will change temporarily, but you really do have to do some self-investigation, and you have to remind yourself that there's these wonderful qualities, and then there's qualities that are challenging. And I need to spend as much time in this place where I'm doing well and thriving with this brain type that I have, and get away from spending too much time, in a job where I'm sitting at a desk and supposed to be looking at, if that's not working, like, let's ask the question, what would work better? So I think it's this it's the self-study. It's like, how do I work in this world? In particular, what are the details of the way that I do well and don't do well? And, then what is the practice for changing that? And sometimes it's just getting in a different seat. Sometimes it's harder work.
I think that's a really powerful place to leave it. I so appreciate your time. And again, huge congratulations on completing this project and creating some takeaways to share with other people. I would highly recommend anyone thinking about doing their 1,000-hour having a look at it, and maybe stealing the idea of working with some researchers to do all of the really boring objective stuff for you, so that you can focus on the yoga. But fantastic, highly recommend people look at it. And I think also a really important reminder that you may have to overcome some internal resistance to doing work that is not your natural kind of work to get that project done. Fantastic. Emily, thank you so much for taking time for us today and for sharing your experiences and your expertise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. It was wonderful. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our yoga medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.